Good afternoon, and welcome to Understanding and Mitigating Security Risks Around Legacy Application Data, a webinar tweet chat combo from Health Systems CIO, sponsored by ELLKAY. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Health Systems CIO, and I will be your moderator today. We are having a simultaneous tweet chat hosted by Kate Gamble, our Managing Editor and Director of Social Media. You can participate in a separate browser or on your phone by using the hashtag HSCIOchat, or you can simply view the tweet chat in the Media Viewer panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll also be using the Q&A panel, so please type your questions in as they occur to you and send them in. Keep the default set to all panelists, and we'll get them to our speakers later in the program. We think this is certainly a good program for questions to get your specific ones answered. And you can download the deck by using the URL on your screen. It's been sent out in the chat box, and it's at the bottom of our slides. So, without further delay, we are going to have our panel discussion for about 35 minutes, and we're featuring Zafar Chaudry, Dr. Zafar Chaudry, SVP and CIO with Seattle Children's Hospital, Neal Ganguly, VP of Hospital Liaisons with the IT Division at Hackensack Meridian Health, and Kamal Patel, CIO with ELLKAY. So let's jump right into our discussion. Dr. Chaudry, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of your organization and role?
Good afternoon. Yes, Zafar Chaudry, CIO at Seattle Children's. We're a healthcare system that covers 4 states, Washington, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. We have about 45 sites with 12,000 people.
Very good. Neal?
Sure. Hackensack Meridian Health is a New Jersey-based health system. We're over $6 billion in revenue, consisting of 17 hospitals, including 3 regional academic medical centers, 2 acute rehab hospitals, and 2 children's hospitals. And we, a couple of years ago, just launched a medical school and a research institute. And my role is the Vice President of IT, reporting to our corporate CIO, Dr. David Reese. And I'm over the hospital relationship managers, the IT budget, and the internal IT PMO.
Very good. And Kamal?
Hi, good afternoon. Kamal Patel. I'm the CIO at ELLKAY. ELLKAY is a healthcare technology company specializing, we work in 5 different business segments of healthcare. We work with hospitals and health systems, ambulatory practices. We work with EHR solution providers, labs, and we also work with payers. In terms of archiving, we have archived more than 160 million unique patient lives with billions and billions of medications, allergies, immunizations in our cloud-based repository. And today we are, in our interoperability side, we are connected to 48,000 practices with 450 different diagnostic laboratories across 200 plus different hospitals and health systems.
Very good. All right. Dr. Chaudry, let's start with you on this. Talk about some of the data transition projects you've been involved with.
So at present at Seattle Children's, our biggest data migration project is linked to our electronic health records. So we're doing a Cerner migration to Epic for all of our clinical systems, and we've probably got about 15 years worth of data that is built into Cerner. So we're currently just spun up a project to figure out how to move that and keep it for an indefinite period of time, because in pediatrics we have to keep records up to 30 years. And at the same time, how do we host it, secure it, protect it? And so that's just spun up. Challenge with the data is that most electronic health records have data that's messy. It's not usually clean data. And trying to map fields from one system to another and then deliver that back to clinicians in a format that historically they can look at but actually make sense of is probably one of the bigger challenges for us.
Right. So 30 years. So obviously this is a unique and extra challenge for children's hospitals. You want to talk a little bit about that? Does that mean you need special expertise in doing this project that not everyone has?
I think we're moving to an environment where it's very, very hard for us to have in-house expertise to do these types of programs, especially around understanding the data. So we find it beneficial to partner with a third party who've done similar type projects. Mm-hmm. The bigger challenge is once you've moved that data, can you actually retrieve it for the length of time that you need to do, right? And we're required legally to keep these records for up to 30 years. But technology changes so much. How do you then retrieve that? I mean, I go back to the days of there used to be a time when people would say, let's archive all our data to a laser disc, and then we'll be able to always read it, but then you can't find a laser disc player anymore. So what do you do with that data?
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. All right. Neal, a little bit about some of the projects that you've dealt with.
Well, currently at Hackensack Meridian, we are in the midst of a major system-wide implementation of both Epic and PeopleSoft. So we've been rolling out Epic in waves, but have rolled PeopleSoft out in a big bang across the enterprise. And that's posed some interesting challenges because Hackensack Meridian as a health system is really comprised of 3 different health systems that came together over the last 2 years. So we're dealing with different pools of legacy data and making decisions around how we should bring that data into Epic and PeopleSoft, and how much of it should maybe not necessarily be transferred into the new systems, but be archived effectively has been somewhat of a challenge. And we've got a project underway right now to work on a strategy overall around the disposition of all the legacy data. And one of the challenges I think we're facing around that is just sort of the governance of that data overall, who owns that data, who identifies really what data needs to be kept and for how long.
Right, because there's lots of, there's the governance issues, the legal issues, and then there's the technical issues. So first you have to figure out, right, legally what the users want, so what's useful, and then legally what do we have to do, and then later is how do we do it, right? So it's a multi-step process. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, cost is a factor in all of that. So how do we do it at as low a cost point as possible?
Right. Very good. All right, Kamal, obviously you're going to have lots of projects this is what you do as a company. So maybe give us, if you want to go through some types, or you can either talk about some of the ones you've done or the different types, if there are some major types of transition projects, if there are sort of big buckets, however you want to tackle that question.
I think, so most of the migration projects, we are moving financials, we're moving clinical. And once in a while we'll come across that they want to retire workflow systems, or they want to retire HR systems. So we do act as a one-stop shop. But among the recent exciting ones, there was one that we worked with Neal's team at Hackensack Meridian recently, where we were not really transitioning the clinical data, but we were transitioning interfaces. So Meridian, when they merged with Hackensack, they had about 400 different practices where we had to move all the interfaces from Cerner to Epic. And this is real live data where we had to do it in a way where it doesn't impact a patient's life. So we put in a strategy. It was a short-term project, so it came to us that, hey, there's a 3-month time window. We need to figure it out. And just recently, there was a cutover date, so and everything had to work on that date. So that went successfully. And the other exciting one that we're working on is with Intermountain Health, where they have a legacy system that they were involved in writing the source code for it in the 80s. So our team had to learn a completely new programming language because back in the day, the systems were designed for compressed storage, and today the systems have a very different mindset around database design and storage criteria. So, our team essentially is learning a completely new programming language, okay, and we're figuring things out. So that's exciting, and so as far as innovation goes, from our side, even if it's a homegrown, so those are fun projects that is also a part of some of the things that we do.
All right, very good. Kamal, let's stick with you for this one to start off. Ensuring the security of data in the application being sunsetted. Do you find that organizations understand how important that is and are focused on it? Is that something they expect you to take care of? For entities that are doing this, what should they be thinking about? How should they be thinking about the data that's being left behind?
I think so. Initially, when health systems are looking at archiving, the primary driver, what I see, is cost, and then the security and usability, okay, that comes into play. There are few health systems where we come across where security is a driving factor because they realize that some of these legacy systems were built at a time which are hosted locally within the health system, and simple things like when they are logging into the EHR, the passwords may not be salted when in storage, which means that if someone has access to the database, they essentially have access to the passwords. So those are some of those things that are driving it, and some of these older systems, they require specific operating system it needs to run on. They require expertise from third parties to manage and maintain it. So moving all of this data into a cloud base with an organization that has experience around modern security, latest tools, pen tests, HITRA certifications. So I'm seeing those are important things that CIOs look at, after cost, when they are looking at, hey, what my strategy is for archiving.
Do you think that looking at cost first, it causes some people to make errors in their focus and what they're doing because they're shortchanging the security aspect of things?
Not necessarily, because when you look at like how health systems, what the priorities, okay, for a CIO are, okay, they are focused on, hey, I want to make sure that the patients are getting the best treatment. I want to make sure my physicians have the pieces, okay, that they need. I want to make sure that all the regulations are getting followed. And the older systems kind of are left behind. So now they are looking at, hey, let me reduce the cost, okay, for these systems, and then all these other pieces are coming. And that's okay in terms of as long as when making decisions, okay, they're looking at all these factors.
All right, very good. Neal, let's go to you for this question. As you're moving off of systems and onto systems, how do you think of security for the data that's not moving? What are some ways you're thinking about that, dealing with that?
Well, I think we look at the security of the data independent of whether an application is being sunsetted or not. As long as that application is going to be functional in our environment and the data is going to be retained in some way, it's going to be subject to our organizational security standards. And of course, we use HIPAA, we use HITECH, we use NIST, and a variety of other standards to kind of protect our environment. But Kamal's point is a good one, that some of the older applications aren't always built to to function at that level, and so we have to make sure that we take that into account. And sometimes that can become a factor in deciding whether to leave an archived sort of read-only version of your sunsetted application available for some period of time, or to migrate that data into then a new repository which will have potentially a higher level of security.
So Zafar, your thoughts on that, on the fact that older applications may just not have what it takes to provide the security that's necessary going forward, so the data's got to move?
So I would agree with the panel's comments to say that yes, when we move data or archive data, it still has to comply with the same security rules that we apply to all the data that we store. But I think that's why when you're sort of thinking, when we look at our strategy around what do we do with data that we need to hold from legacy systems, then we're looking to say, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't be in that business. We know we need access to the data, and we know we need that around the clock, but should we as a healthcare organization really be hosting, storing, securing that data, or is it better to look towards a service provider, a cloud-type strategy, looking to a vendor who, A, has more experience with that type of data, but at the same time can provide us assurances around how it's accessible, how it's stored, how it's secured. So we're actually looking to move that risk of legacy system data to third parties who have the right credentials to help us then display that data back to our clinicians.
And Zafar, would you say that that's part of a general strategy that a lot of CIOs are employing, which is let's leverage the cloud, let's use the expertise of these service providers and vendors to move some of the risk and also the cost out of our health system, so to speak, and give it to them?
Yes, so I'm definitely seeing more of an uptake around that. I think the challenge for many CIOs is still around how do you fund the shift from a CapEx to an OpEx type model. So we've traditionally been buying hardware, putting in our data centers, using capital to do that, and then sweating that asset. So then you can put your data and systems on there. But when you move to the cloud-first strategy and partnerships with vendors with specialist skills, that all becomes OpEx expenditure, and certainly in my organization, it's harder to come across OpEx than it is to come across CapEx.
Neal, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that discussion of budgeting.
I agree with Zafar on that. It is definitely harder to increase your OpEx budget, and one of the things you have to do is overcome the CFO and the finance department's concerns around the fact that IT expenditures are just ever increasing. However, his point is also very valid that we're not necessarily best practice practitioners in the art of data archiving, and that there are vendors out there who could handle it more securely and more efficiently than we could within our shops. I do think you have to really do a cost-benefit analysis and look at it over time, and I think at some point you have to think of what your timeline horizons are when you do those calculations. Instead of 3 years, you need to look at 5 or 8 year horizons. And there's a risk that you end up getting locked in with a vendor when you start to rely on them heavily, and it's something you have to take into consideration as well.
Very good. All right. Kamal, let's start with you on this one. Can you envision a scenario, or have you seen anything in dealing with all the clients you've dealt with, where the security focus moves from the old to the new to the detriment of the old?
Yeah. It's so when we are moving the data from the old to the new, the focus, it'll start with things like, hey, is there a common framework for security? Does it support multi-factor authentication? Does the security of the archive integrate well with the underlying health systems authentication mechanisms, whether it's EHR authentication or Active Directory? So we have seen in every project that we're working with, where we go through all of these criteria.
Okay, very good. Neal, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with Kamal. I mean, it really does depend on the infrastructure and the nature of the older applications that you may be trying to archive. But generally, I think security is a focus for us across all our applications and data, regardless of whether you're sort of statusing it as old or new. So it's always a focus. It's just a question of what technologies you're dealing with and then how you're going to remediate any security concerns that may arise.
Very good. Zafar, any thoughts on that?
I think as many organizations, doesn't really matter what size you are in terms of healthcare provider, we're all running hundreds of individual applications. Many of those applications are critical to our operations and therefore get more face time than those applications that are older or maybe operationally redundant. The challenge we see in our environment is, yes, we want to apply the same rules to secure the data from whether it's a current application or a legacy application, or it's current data or archive data, but then staffing up to the levels to provide a consistent experience across all those domain spaces becomes harder and harder, especially depending on where you are geographically. So here in Seattle, the competition for tech resources and skills in the security domain space are really, really challenging. And so when you do hire folks to take care of your security, it's inevitable that the focus tends to end up being on current applications and current data versus legacy applications and legacy data. And that's why I feel, certainly for us as an organization, having a strategy that partners with someone to bring in some of that expertise could take the pressure off our day-to-day operation.
Very good. All right, excellent. Yes, go ahead.
Just to add something to what Zafar said. So what there was a scenario where we have seen that when hospitals...
Kamal, if you could just speak a little louder, that'd be great.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Sure. So what we have seen is when hospitals are bringing in outside consultants to help them with the older legacy data, and they want to fix something in the older system, they are more concerned about not breaking anything when they are touching these legacy systems. So sometimes they will give a contractor administrative access, just so that they can get the job done. And those are the risks, that exposes the hospital from a security standpoint. So the older systems are always going to have some disadvantage towards, moving to a newer, more secure environment.
Okay, very good. All right, Kamal, let's stick with you for the next question. What role can the cloud play in handling sunsetted application data in a cost-effective way?
So I think we discussed some of the things. So, having a common framework for security, the SSO integration. A lot of times, hospitals have a lot of systems that they want to sunset. So it allows vendors like us or others to go in and buy space in a cloud environment across all of the systems. So you're not going like, hey, this system has this much storage, but we can look at things on a holistic level when the data is archived.
Very good. All right. Zafar, we talked a lot about cost and cloud. So what are your thoughts around that? You obviously sound like you're definitely in favor of doing these things.
I'm definitely in favor, but I'm also, to some extent, apprehensive, because what we have to be very careful of is if we are moving, into Neal's point earlier, if we are moving our data to a provider in the cloud, then we really don't want that provider to hold us hostage. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a mechanism where the data can be moved to them and the data can be moved out. But at the same time, we don't want to be charged for data transactions either. So some cloud-based vendors will say, you put your data in their cloud, and then every time I see that data and the data transfers back and forth, I'm getting billed for that data transfer. That can become very expensive very quickly. So we have to be extremely careful and go back to Neal's point around, we have to do a full cost of ownership to see what that 5, 7, 8 year cost would look like.
So are you saying that that's not an arrangement you want to get into, or it depends on the cost that they're charging, that the arrangement itself may not be bad if the costs are reasonable?
So personally, I wouldn't want to be in an arrangement where I'm constantly having to monitor whether or not my doctors are looking at the data and bringing that data back, because some of the historical data may be used for analytics and other things, and that could be massive data transfer. I'd rather be in a relationship that says, my data is stored, it's protected, it's viewable, it's downloadable, but I'm only being charged for those costs of hosting and delivering, not exchanging that data.
Right, right. Neal, you, as Zafar mentioned, you talked about the relationship with the cloud vendor, and we did a whole series of these last year on establishing a relationship with the cloud vendor and best practices and contracting and onboarding and all these kind of things. So it is huge, right? It is a marriage, and nobody wants to go into a marriage thinking about divorce, but that's an important part of it sometimes. So just more of your thoughts around making sure your organization is in a good position when getting into these relationships.
Yeah, I completely agree with Zafar. I think you have to have a very clear understanding of the nature of the relationship and how that data is going to be used so that you can build accurate cost models, whether you're being charged on a transactional basis or whether you're agreeing on fixed fees for hosting, et cetera. Depending on the nature of the data, different agreements may work right or work well for a particular organization. But understanding that very clearly is important, because otherwise any of your cost modeling is going to be off and it'll lead to dissatisfaction in the relationship at some point. But overall, I think the advantages to the cloud, and Zafar and Kamal both mentioned this earlier, is that it does take the headache of managing and securing this data off the shoulders of the in-house IT staff. And there's an inherent value to that should be factored as well.
Very good. Talk about more about cost. Any more we want to talk about on cost? Kamal, your advice on how people can keep their costs down when they're doing these projects?
I think we covered a lot about costs, but I think when like I mentioned, the starting point how the CIOs are looking at is, hey, how much I'm paying today? What am I going to pay with the archive? What am I going to get, when we discontinue using the archive for whatever reason it is? Are we going to have access to the data? So if the functionalities are met and the cost is kept lower than what they are paying, and if there is flexibility around vendors to adjust to their OPEX cost versus the CAPEX cost, those are some important criteria that vendors like us and others would need those flexibilities to work with the important areas that a hospital CIO would need.
Okay, very good. All right, next question. Kamal, let's stick with you here. We're talking about, we've talked about moving from one vendor to another. We've mentioned some specific vendors. Have you found in your experience, and this is maybe informative to the people on the line who are, you don't have to name specific vendors if you don't want to, but can it be more difficult moving off of a particular vendor based on just sort of their approach to the whole process, one versus the other? How can that be dealt with as a health system?
I think it really depends on is the vendor aligned with the needs of the health system. So if you look at us, we are looking ELLKAY, the way we are looking at archiving is not a business that is going to be there forever. So we have a bigger strategy around archive where we'll align with the health systems, and we are filling a gap that these health systems have today around archiving the data. So the overall strategy requires things like what kind of security team does the vendor have? So, for example, our chief compliance officer, she came from Mount Sinai, and she has experience running and understanding the compliance requirements within a hospital. And does an organization have a chief privacy officer? Do they have a chief security officer? Do they have, what is part of the legal team? What are the processes? How much cyber insurance they have? So if those certifications are met, depending on what is important to the health system, and finding that balance between the two. One of the example I gave is, with Neal's team at Hackensack Meridian, we are not only doing archiving the data or helping them with the transition of the archive of the clinical data, but we are also helping them with migrating the interfaces. So depending on those strategies, I think the hospital would look at different vendors. And I think that in the space that we are in, there are a good few vendors depending on the needs that these health systems can work with.
Very good. Zafar, in your experience, have you found that, when you're sunsetting a vendor, you're basically saying goodbye? That can not be the best feeling in the world for them, and they can perhaps want to focus their energies more on customers that are staying with them. Have you seen a big difference from one vendor to the next in terms of them being willing to sort of send you off on a good note, so to speak?
So I've definitely seen a level of variability. It's a very vast variability between vendors as to how they react when you say you're sunsetting their system. So there is that complication of it could be a clean or a messy divorce. And so a lot of times when you have a really old system, you haven't refreshed your terms and conditions for many, many years, which means potentially there aren't the right termination exit clauses in the contract to allow you to exit from that vendor. But at the same time, there are also technological challenges. So depending on how old the system is, how old the code was that the system was written in, and I think Kamal mentioned this earlier around, the databases can be complex or non-complex, they can be secure or non-secure, or they may have been written so long ago that the vendor you're dealing with only has 2 people left that have any knowledge of how that system is actually even plugged together. So I've seen a gamut of, healthcare is interesting because you have applications where you have 2 people in the garage who are running the application, and then you have big monolithic corporations running an application, but they wrote the code 35 years ago, and it's still being used. So there's a lot of variability.
Very good. Neal, have you seen differences, and any advice on sort of engaging with that vendor that's going to be sunsetted so that you give yourself the best chance of having a good working relationship through the process?
Absolutely. One of the things that Zafar said that is important to keep in mind is you should be looking at your terms and conditions with your existing vendors periodically to ensure that they're staying current with, A, the organization's needs, and B, whatever the current technologies are. As an example, I'm originally a part of an organization called JFK Health System that joined Hackensack Meridian, and we were running a legacy McKesson application called Horizon Clinicals, which is 30-plus years old. So for us, there are literally, I think, 3 people left, no longer with McKesson, but with Allscripts now, who actually know how to get that data out. And it'll be an interesting journey that we're just kicking off. But none of that was envisioned 30 years ago when that contract was signed. So it is really important to stay on top of that. My experience, fortunately, in my career has been generally good. Most of the vendors have been willing to help get your data out and migrate, because I think most people know that eventually you may come around again and they want to preserve good relationships. But it can be variable, to Zafar's point, and I've seen it more variable with some of the smaller and mid-sized vendors.
Zafar, have you ever seen that be leveraged as an opportunity to extract some costs that you think were unfair? So if you're leaving me, you're going to pay for it?
Oh, yeah. So I would agree that when you have the discussion about leaving a particular vendor, they're always disappointed, and yes, they come around to the fact that, relationships need to be preserved, but that won't stop them from hitting you with costs for that data migration. And those also vary. So some will charge you time and materials for people that they put on that project, and some will charge you a fixed fee, and that's also variable.
Right. Kamal, have you essentially, in a lot of your work, are acting on behalf of the health system to help them get this done, and probably interacting a lot with that system being sunsetted. So you're almost their advocate. Would you say that? You kind of take some of this, what might be unpleasant interaction, and you go take care of it for them? Does that make sense?
Yes. So our starting point is we want to be the most likable company in healthcare.
So do I. Everybody should. That's a good goal.
So if you understand, so in all of our contracts, okay, the one thing that we lay out is, hey, you own the data. If we share our costs, okay, with these health systems, and we tell them that if you can have us, okay, with 3 years, 5 years, okay, depending on how we are pricing it, if we can hit some of these numbers here, okay, and our costs are covered, okay, then you can have the data. And in a lot of these cases, they are asking us where they keep a copy of the data. So in those cases, when we are migrating the data, then we are giving them a copy of the data in a model where they can do analytics, okay, and reporting off of it, depending on, what the important things are to the health system. So I think being transparent is an important thing for any vendors, and I think in the space that we are in, there are some good vendors who would align to the health system needs, or at least I haven't seen anybody at least on the archiving side holding a hospital or health system hostage.
All right, very good. Let's go to our Ask a Co-Panelist section here, and then we'll get to some audience questions. Just a reminder, send in your questions, and we'll get them in front of our panelists. So let me start with you, Zafar. Do you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
My question for Kamal is, in terms of when you are migrating data on behalf of customers, are you extensively using cloud infrastructure to store that information, or are you still in the business of running your own infrastructures as well as doing that transformation work?
So we are using cloud infrastructure to store the data, but the way it works is like when we are working on the project, when the data is getting migrated, we do create a local environment where that works happen, and that is primarily due to getting the speed. And that environment is then, once the data gets to a certain point where it's cleaned up, so there is the part about extracting the data, the migrating the data, and then that data goes into the cloud storage once it is all cleaned up. Okay, so things like normalization of the data. If the data is coming from 20 different systems, we do some creative things like running it through our own EMPI and matching the patient records, but it does end up in a cloud environment.
Very good. Neal, do you have a question for either of your co-panelists?
Sure, for actually either of my co-panelists. Just as we see in the industry this constant push for a drive to stronger interoperability standards, How do you think that's going to play in the archiving world and data transition world over the next few years?
Zafar, I'll start with you.
Can you repeat that? Sorry, Neal.
Sure. So, as Chime and HIMSS and other organizations have been really advocating for tighter interoperability standards and driving much stronger standards overall in the industry, do you think that's going to have an impact in the need for some of these archiving solutions and how this business kind of works today? And maybe it's more for Kamal than Zafar, but that's sort of my question.
So I believe that will have an influencing impact. But my bigger belief is that if we want vendors to comply to interoperability standards and make data flow freely between systems, then that really needs to come at the national federal level. It should be in policy to say healthcare data must be available, because having that data at the right point, at the point of care, allows better care. So I don't know why we sort of beat around the bush with this. We need groups to influence vendors. The government should say it's all about people's health, everyone, so therefore it should be available.
Very good. Kamal?
And I think to add to Zafar's point, like, we are seeing a trend where the payers are driving this. Okay, so even if we like, if you look at what happened over the last several years, we saw organizations like Commonwealth and Care Equality pop up, okay, as non-profits, and then we saw, like at last HIMSS, we saw, okay, that CMS said that, hey, the patient has the right to their entire data set, okay, and for people who are going through certain plans, okay, or if they're getting Medicare reimbursements, then that data must be exposed to these patients. And I completely agree with that. And you know, if the drive is coming from a federal level, okay, then it's going to force everybody to expose that. Now, my belief in terms of where I come from is that the data accessibility, regardless of the type of healthcare data, must be available to the patient at any point in time with no cost, because it is their data. And I think that some of these driving factors that are going on in the industry would eventually, I hope, they end up on that route.
Very good. All right, I got an audience question I want to get to here. Regarding data retention, what do you do after the time period has lapsed for requirements to retain the data? Do you have the data destroyed, or do you continue paying the annual operating costs in perpetuity? Zafar?
So we in healthcare have traditionally been reluctant to destroy data even when it should be destroyed. My personal policy in organizations I've worked in is to say, if we've met the legal requirements for keeping the data and we've stored it for the period of time, once we have that cycle come up, and we mark all our data for destruction, then that data should be destroyed. But it's very difficult, isn't it? Because if you ask someone, should we destroy the data, especially if the person's clinical, most physicians will say, well, no, we always need that data. But there'll come a point where if you're storing data, be it electronically or even on paper, how much of it can you actually store?
Very good. Kamal, your thoughts on the question? You want me to repeat it? Let me know.
No. So once the term expires, some of our customers may say that, hey, you know, we want to keep the data, but our use has gone down, and hopefully as a vendor, they would tell us that maybe your costs have gone down, so if we can work out the cost structure. And some of them would say that, hey, you know, can you give us a data in a format that we can host, okay, for our compliance internally? You know, maybe they just store it in a, in a locker somewhere. So at least if they ever want it, okay. And usually I see this with small community health systems, where if they do need it, then there is a specifications to get to it. So we would always align with what our customers want, which is the hospitals and health systems, and we would make sure that we are helping them out with whatever strategy they have.
All right, very good. Let's try this question. Zafar, for people that are dealing with this or about to encounter it, do you have any advice on something they could go back, a challenge for them? Here's what you need to go do. Here's what you need to investigate in order to tackle this problem. Any sort of final advice to get them off and running after the call today?
So my first challenge to folks would really be around, do you know all of the systems you actually have, and do you know which are current, which are legacy, as your starter for 10? Certainly we found, and in every organization I've worked in healthcare, I've found that we really don't have a clear picture at times of all of the systems we're potentially running. And once you know that, then you can actually come up with a strategy around how do you store that data and keep it legally protected.
Very good. So start with an inventory type thing.
Yeah.
Kamal, does that make sense to you?
Yes, I completely, it's the first challenge. I'm not going to challenge any potential customers.
You don't want to make them mad. No.
Exactly. But so, our drive, because a lot of the people who are in the role that they are in, they have a lot of experience, and each of these health systems have different driving forces. So we have seen various flavors on what is important to them, and as a vendor, we will educate them around our experience, but aligning with their priorities is something where we come from.
All right, very good. Well, that's about all we had time for today. I want to thank everyone for attending. Regarding continuing education, those of you who attend our events get one CEU towards the CHIME CHCIO certification program. So if you've asked us to let CHIME know you were here, we will. Otherwise, make sure you let them know. And if you need a certificate of attendance for another CEU program, you can use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when an archive recording of this event has been posted to our YouTube channel. If you'd like us to produce a webinar on the topic of your choice, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to view our upcoming schedule. So with that, I want to thank our distinguished panel, Dr. Zafar Chaudry, Neal Ganguly, and Kamal Patel, and I want to thank ELLKAY for sponsoring this event. And I want to thank you for attending. With that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.